Welcome, everyone, back to the Kriya Yoga podcast. I'm here with a very special guest, Ellen Grace O'Brien, Yogacharya O'Brien. She is the spiritual director and founder of the Center for Spiritual Enlightenment. She is an author of the books The Jewel of Abundance and a book of poetry called The Moon Reminded Me. She's a singer and also the founder of the Yoga Hour podcast, which has now been going strong for over 10 years now. Yogacharya O'Brien is my elder sister in the Kriya tradition and whom I've developed a great deal of love and respect and reverence for. She's a student of Roy Eugene Davis and was initiated into Kriya Yoga and ordained to teach Kriya Yoga by him, and so represents the same lineage as Mr. Davis and his predecessors. So it's with great joy that I welcome Yogacharya O'Brien to the Kriya Yoga podcast for episode 52, which marks 2 years since the podcast began. So welcome, Yogacharya O'Brien. It's wonderful to have you.
Thanks so much, Ryan, and congratulations on 2 years. That's a big commitment. It's a lot of time and energy and blessings going forth into the universe. So congratulations.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Today, we're going to take some time to talk about the theme of development within one's Kriya Yoga practice, with the idea of exploring maybe tips, what beginners need to know to get the most out of it, and then ideally segueing into what it's like to practice Kriya Yoga in an intermediate sense once you're fully established in it. So before we get into that, though, if you don't mind letting our listeners know, what was your introduction to Kriya Yoga and how long have you been on this path?
I lose count sometimes. So I had the blessing of knowing and studying with Roy Eugene Davis, as you mentioned, for just about 40 years. I met him in 1979, and he was my introduction to the path of Kriya Yoga. And that took, really all it was one meeting with him, and being able to hear the teaching so clearly, it spoke to my heart. You know, later on, I was writing about that meeting, and I said, I've had this recognition, you know, much later, looking back, that in some ways it was my own heart that was speaking, because there was such a deep resonance to the teachings of Kriya Yoga. So that started me on my journey. 1979. Then in 1980, I was initiated into Kriya Yoga by him. And then I was ordained in 1982. And then, you know, the rest is learning and growing and taking care of karma and surfing.
Yes. And so you've been serving in the Kriya Yoga tradition for quite a while. I mean, that's most of your adult life.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I was only 5 when I began. Just kidding.
Yeah. Yeah. That's, you know, when I think back on Mr. Davis and how he began when he was around 18 or so, and how he spent
you know, just hitting retirement. And sometimes the people who are, you know, later on in life just say, you know, why didn't I find this sooner? And I don't know the answer to that. You know, I just think it's a matter of, you know, when we're ready, and there's certain indicators of when we're ready, but what makes that happen for one person, you know, versus another, I don't really know. And it makes me all the more grateful, for finding the path when I did. Like many devotees on the path of Kriya Yoga, I won't say that I couldn't imagine my life without Kriya Yoga. I can imagine it, and it's not very pretty. So, I feel, there's a quote at the end of the Holy Science where Sri Yukteswar quotes from the Vedas, that the world is unsafe and unstable like a drop of water on a lotus leaf. And the company of a divine person, even for a moment, can save and redeem us. And that's really how I feel. I feel like I was saved and redeemed, and I don't think of people as sinners. That's not what the word means to me. It means that my life was taken in a whole different direction. And so I'm grateful for that grace.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as you say, having that grace it's a wonderful thing. And, as I remember spending time with Mr. Davis and kind of that effect that it had on me subtly, even as I went back into my world and away from retreats and so on, I've also noticed that with you. I don't know if I've ever told you that, but whenever we've spent time chatting or meeting, I always find myself in that same kind of that same kind of state of upliftment. So again, I just want to thank you for that.
That's true. And I feel that too when we have an opportunity to share, because our conversation is generally about God and gurus and yoga. And that's the function of a satsang, of us having a spiritual community that we're a part of, and it should, in the highest way, do that for us. I mean, there's even a verse in the Bhagavad Gita about that, how, those who are on the path should come together and lift one another up with positive conversation. And that's a wonderful thing to have.
Yes. And hopefully this will also benefit those who are listening. To get into the topic that we want to discuss today, the reason I asked you about how you came to know about Kriya Yoga and when you began the practice, I just want individuals to know who don't already know you that you do have a lot of experience in this kind of work, in this ministry. And so when you work with individuals who have just discovered Kriya Yoga or are super enthusiastic and ready to just take the bull by the horns and do everything they can, I'm kind of curious, what kind of insights do you have for people so that they, burn like a log that goes throughout the night rather than a straw fire that burns up and goes out?
It's a good question, because it kind of like with Ayurveda, right? It depends on the individual temperament. Some people are really fired up and enthusiastic, and others are doubtful and suspicious. And so it kind of depends on the person. But at the base of it, I would say always we have that recommendation from our tradition of just meditate, just set up a steady meditation practice and begin to prove the teachings for yourself, because nothing works like that. Anything that you read or do, or it's having direct insight that makes all of the difference. And so I always remind people that I can't teach them anything they don't already know, in the sense of fundamentally, we are awake at the core of our being, and we know that, and all about life and the cosmos is accessible to us, as our teacher would tell us. So I always point people in that direction, and to have a steady practice, but to have the sense that this tradition teaches you can and must experience directly what you're studying. So that's the first piece. So, regardless of where they're coming from, if they're on fire or if they're just kind of smoldering with doubt, then, I point them that way.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the idea of people who come at it with doubt, and then you use the idea of being on fire and smoldering. And it reminds me of Ramana Maharshi used to say, or I've read, that there were three types of students. There was the student who is like gunpowder that just takes a match or a spark and it blows up. Then there's the one that's like charcoal that takes a little bit longer to get going. And then there's another student that's like wet coal, and it will eventually ignite, but it has to have that consistent heat applied to it. And, those of you who already know you probably know this, and those who are going to get to know you will learn that you definitely project more of a patient and compassionate energy. And usually when I meet people who are doubtful, my response is always, well, if you don't get it, you don't get it. And I can't, there's nothing I can do about it. So from your perspective, how do you encourage one through initial doubts? How do you approach that with individuals?
I think the emphasis, through the lineage of the masters in our tradition is, you are divine. You are supreme consciousness itself. And so if we have some way we can remind people of that, which is a role of a teacher or a guru to remind, then I think, regardless of the obstacles that a student faces, somewhere they hear that, and you say, you are consciousness. Life is consciousness. Life is a play of consciousness. And you are that. It might set the head spinning a little bit, but the heart and the soul know that and hear that. So I think any way we can say that. And, I've been, so having been teaching for, what did we just say, adding up the years, like 40 years or whatever. One time a student said to me, because for a long time I gave talks, every Sunday, and pretty much I'm still doing that, although I take some breaks now because there are many other teachers in our community. But he said to me, it's amazing to me how, you just say the same thing, for decades in different ways. And I thought, well, I think that's a compliment, that I haven't deviated from the core message, but I do find, I do try to find interesting ways to talk about it. But anyway, back to our point, I think that as a way of encouragement, people really just need to hear the truth. But not in a harsh way. It can be in a loving way also. And of course, beyond that is knowing the truth about them. Right. Because people feel that. We all feel that.
Yeah. As you were talking, that idea came to mind. You can say to someone, you are divine, you are pure consciousness, you are these things. And anyone can say that. But I think it does make a bit of a difference if the individual saying that knows it.
Oh, complete difference. Because what happens is if you are able to come from that place, if you know it, then there's a transmission of consciousness that occurs. And that's what this tradition is all about. That's why you can't get it from a book. You can to a certain degree, but being with a teacher, there's that transmission of what the truth is that you experience. You may not be able to explain it. You may not know what it was you've experienced, but it's uplifting.
Right. Well, you and I, since our teacher is Roy Eugene Davis, and we had that experience. And many people often, what always makes me laugh though, is when people write to me and say, "Where can I find a Kriya Yoga teacher?"
I've had people say that to my face.
Yeah. It cracks me up. But anyway, for people who are looking and looking for a teacher, maybe that resonates more with them or their experience or their temperament, do you have any recommendations for people? For me, it just happened. I don't remember it being an issue. It's just one day I figured out that Mr. Davis was in Georgia and I found him. So when you interact with people who have that question or that interest, how do you, what do you say to them?
I usually just tell them to pray about it, and to ask for divine guidance, because it's a karmic thing, isn't it? And it's also a little mysterious. I wasn't looking for a guru, when I met Roy Jean Davis. I don't think I even really knew what one was. I had a little bit of experience reading, Alan Watts and Zen teachings and the American Transcendentalists. And so I was interested, spiritually. But I didn't have any idea about the deep teachings, the traditions that were actually available until I met him.
Right. Well, moving away from the idea of working with individuals who have some doubt to move through. Let's say we're talking to new people who've learned Kriya Yoga, who are ready to, organize their life so that they get the most benefit out of the work. What are some general recommendations that you have for them so that they're able to stick with it for the long haul and to, go deeper into it?
Really, I think keeping it simple is helpful. Keeping it simple, having a daily practice. That's the core of it. That's the crux of it. And, when you read Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, the definition of Kriya Yoga, it's pretty simple. Lead a disciplined life, study the nature of reality, the nature of consciousness, inquire, what is this? And what am I? And then use that kind of study to also, as you're studying the texts and the teachings that your teacher has put forth, keep a spiritual diary. Ask yourself, is this working? I've been doing this. What am I experiencing? Use yourself as your own laboratory. And then the surrender factor, of course, wraps it all up. Like, don't get too wrapped up in your ideas of results, because that'll take you off course. You can't get there by your ego because it's beyond that. So it's a beautiful path that's just so clear and simple. And I think, of course, when we come onto the path and we're enthusiastic about it, we want instant enlightenment, and, that rarely happens. It can happen. And, in my experience, and I think in that of many others, there are some graces that happen in the beginning, I think due to, you're kind of on that trajectory and you're enthusiastic, and that's really focusing your energy. And I don't know, some grace of God gives you some openings, some meditation openings. You get to see some inner light, you hear some inner sound. But and I remember for me, God was just everywhere. God was the wind. I could look in the phone book and be inspired. It was just like that. And that's a helpful thing. It's like falling in love. But then there is the after the honeymoon stage where it can dry up. And then you start to have doubts, like, well, is this really my path? I had those experiences, but I'm not having them now. And, my meditations were a lot more, I struggled in the beginning, but then I had those interesting experiences, and now it's just boring. And so, then the mind, then you're ready for the deeper work, really.
Yeah. Well, that's very good. It reminds me, a student recently wrote to me, and I'd been interacting with her, and as she described her practice to me, it sounded like it was very intensive and going very well. And then I got this email saying, "I need some help. How can I intensify my practice?" And I'm thinking, wow, of the stuff that you've told me, I don't really understand what needs to be more intense about it. So I'm guessing that. Yeah, I need to talk to her again, but I'm guessing that maybe she hit that point where now it's about making it just simply something consistent that you do without an attachment to an experience.
Yeah. Yeah. There's that double-edged sword about having meditation experiences where then you become attached to them, and you're trying to carry that into the next meditation. I want to see that again. I want to experience that again. But in my experience, those things come completely unbidden, right, and they're never the same. And right, so it's futile to try and compare one meditation session to another. And ultimately, and I think our teacher has, been such a wonderful guide in that regard to say, look, you may have some bells and whistles, and fine if you do, but ultimately it's not about that, because that's all, connected to the phenomenal realm, whether it is gross or subtle phenomena. And what we're looking at is to get beyond that experience into pure existence being. So you can let that go.
Yeah. That's the tricky part, though. And when I remember reading the Holy Science, Sri Teshwar talks about these kind of levels or states of being, and he says that you can't really comprehend the higher states of being so long as you are identified with matter or the mind. And I guess the main idea is through our practices, we're learning to kind of pop through or push ourselves beyond that just to get the direct experience of it.
It is. And, one of the things that I think is surprising about Holy Science, which I really like, because I tend to have some part of my nature anyway that's devotional, not all of it. But, we look at Sri Yukteswar as such a Gyan yogi, right? A Gyan avatar, really. But Holy Science is very devotional and he talks about the compelling power of divine love. And so, even though we're on this path that is, that requires us to clarify our discernment, and it is a wisdom path. It is a path of inquiry, but it is also a path of heart. And if you can have love for God, however you think of God, love for Guru, that has helped me to stay steadfast, because for me, that quality of heart is connected to being fully alive. And then the path is, as Yogananda described it, ever new joy, because it is our life. It is our life experience. So not everything happens in meditation, obviously. It's sort of like being in that constant, I remember when I was first studying with Mr. Davison, he had a little affirmation card he gave out, and it was something like how did it go? The constant and vibrant awareness of the presence of God, or the vibrant awareness of the presence of God is my constant companion, every moment of every day. And so that's what I like to cultivate, is that constant and vibrant awareness of the presence of God, moment to moment, every day.
Yeah, that's great that you mentioned this card, because I had one too, and it was, again, I wish I remembered it exactly, but it was the radiant purity of my essence of being illumines my mind and conscience. It was something like that, right. But that was something that really spoke to me.
Yes.
the idea that you're talking about with jnana or knowledge and devotion, I just want to talk about that for a moment, if you don't mind, because I've had students often say to me, "I'm not devotional." I just, they think about Yogananda and they say, "I'm not like that." And I try to explain to them that, devotion, like when I'm devoted to something or someone, I want to know about them. If I'm devoted to a person, I want to know what's her favorite flower, what kind of music does she like, what chores make her really happy when someone does it. Because if you know those things, that then you're able to act on them. And so I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that, because you mentioned Sri Yukteswar, and I think that that's very important because his devotion was through knowing what this stuff is. And if you spend your time trying to figure it out, well, what other kind of devotion do you need? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and it seems to me that once you know, then love is alive in you. That is the love of God, and it is alive in you. I think of, there's some part in the autobiography where Sri Yukteswar says something like, this is talking about this, like there's really just one word you can say, and that's God. That's like it. And so I think that having that love awakened, and it's not something that we create. And I understand people say they're not devotional, but usually that's related to they can't resonate with deity worship, or they don't like to sing kirtan. But we're all devoted to something. We're all giving our time and energy to something. And so I think it's learning more about it, what it means in a subtle sense, to be devoted to something. Like you say, you want to know when you're devoted to someone or something, but we're also kind of talking around the same thing, which is that there's a magnetism to love, that pulls you to be connected, in your thoughts, in your heart, in your orientation. So that's the kind of devotion that is helpful. It's not so much like how it is expressed outwardly. And I also find on the yoga path that, I think Kriya Yoga, of course, contains all the classical forms of yoga, through the practices that were given. So we have, wisdom yoga and discernment. We also have devotion. We have service. We have Raja Yoga step-by-step methodology. So it's all there. And I think that is about balancing our temperament, balancing our nature. So very often people have said, I remember one student who came to me and said, and I came to this path, and, he's, scientifically bent, engineer. He said, I came to this path and, I just know, I'm a Gyan yogi, I'm a wisdom yogi, that's my way. And he said, a year or so into it, I discover I'm a flaming bhakti, so it was like the underside, of his personality that hadn't been expressed. And he found this amazing love for God. So, and when we look at Yogananda's story, for example, how much bhakti he had, but how his relationship with Sri Yukteswar, pulled that wisdom out of him. And he was such a balanced individual, and in that way.
Yeah. This kind of brings me to sort of a segue point from things people need to think about when they're just getting started to, well, now once you're in it, how's it going to go? And I'm curious what your take is on just simply the experience of life, because what I have noticed is often when people first get involved in spiritual practices, and I had this problem too, so I'm not calling anyone out other than myself. There's an idea that once you become a yogi or once you start doing these types of things, as though then it's just going to be smooth sailing. Nothing's going to go wrong. You're going to have all the money you want. It's going to be perfect all the time. And I think I've seen people, once they get into it and they start to recognize, well, my mind is calmer and I do have greater insights into the wholeness of life, but I still don't get along with my mother-in-law and the world is still kind of a mess. And how do you speak to or address that kind of transitionary period to keep people going?
Well, it's helpful to know that most people go through that and that it is part of the path. I remember I was really furious. I was furious I was at my teacher. I was furious at the path. I was furious at God. I wrote a letter to God, firing God. It's like, it was so immature, but it kind of needed to do that. It was like, every curse word I could think of, you're supposed to be in charge of the universe. This is a big mess. It was hysterical. But I needed to get that out. And of course I recognized, that it was some old theology I was carrying about how God was supposed to be. So that was a really important part of my journey to do that. And, that was early on, but, I had that expectation that things were going to clear up in my life. And, a little while onto the path, things actually got worse instead of better. And that was really disappointing. And I was disappointed in myself because I was doing much worse. So I had that little, life was difficult. I had a lot of things that weren't working for me. I came onto the path. I thought, great, like you say, this is fixed. And then, what happened to me, as is common, is the lights come on, right? The light gets turned up in your mental field. And so you actually begin to see more of the depth of your challenge, of your thought patterns. You become aware of how you have created certain realities that are problematic for you. And so then it feels kind of confrontive. And, how am I going to get through that? So, that's one of the blessings of having a teacher, is that they can say, look, that's really normal. One of the things that happens is, you come onto the path, you start to practice, and yes, you become more aware. And one of the things you become more aware of is your own errors. And the path then is a practice of figuring out how to clear up your karma, how to clear up these past impressions that are altering your reality in negative ways, and how to avoid doing that going forward. So for me, one of the best things we can do is just say, that's normal. It's normal and it should happen. And you're seeing, what did it take, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years to get here, and think about how you lived up until that time. And of course it's like, what was that? A movie that was out years and years ago. It used to make me think of this. It was a comedy. I do remember Gene Wilder was in it, but there's a train that comes into the station and they try to stop the train. But that train is like a slow-mo, of the train just coming in, and it doesn't stop, and it just crashes and crashes and crashes. And this doesn't sound very heartening, but it's good to recognize that, yes, we get on the path, we pull that cord to stop the karma train, but it's still coming in. It still has momentum. And so that's why we have a sadhana. So we can work to clear that up and to actually begin to create new karmas that are more positive.
Yeah. And so basically, what I gathered from that is the idea that once you get on a path of meditation, and ideally, if you're practicing yoga, you're going to be practicing the yamas and niyamas, truthfulness, harmlessness, contentment, things which innately just tend to make one's life better. However, when you start to do that, it's like all of a sudden you talk about the lights coming on, where you start to see all the stuff from the past that was a momentum that was causing you problems previously, but you didn't notice it until now you're starting to make these changes.
Yeah, because before you come on the path and before you're awake, at least for me, I was pretty sure that those things were because of what other people did.
Right. That's not true.
Yeah. And then you go, oh, I'm involved in this. This is my life. It's coming out of my thoughts and my speech and my behavior. And, how do I undo what I did?
Yeah. And you mentioned the importance of having a teacher in that situation. I wholeheartedly agree with that. I remember, I know you've heard me tell this story before. I remember once at CSA, you were there and you were giving a lecture on the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And I remember thinking, well, I just got done writing a commentary on that. I don't need to sit and listen to this. And so I got up and I started to leave. And as I was going out through the dining hall, Roy was coming the opposite direction. He looked at me and he said, "You get back in there." And so I went and I sat back down. But anyway, I remember that talk you were giving, and right as I was leaving and coming back in, obviously, you were talking about the first statement of now instruction in yoga practice. And that really stuck with me for all these years. And the way I took it, though, was I tended to, and still do, encourage people that means that in order to begin practicing yoga, you kind of have to be at a certain point where you're capable of doing it. And so I encourage people to work with a counselor, to find a therapist, to find a coach, so that they become strong enough that they can do this work rather than turning the yoga work itself into like a healing process. And the reason I'm kind of bringing all this up is because that point that you're talking about where the lights come up, it seems that if they already have a sense of maturity and strength and resilience, that it's less likely to kind of shut them down. So what I'm asking this lead up, what do you feel the role is in individuals in working with counselors or doing that? I know the teacher plays a role a little bit there, but not all teachers are fantastic counselors or psychologists. So how do you address that?
Oh, yeah. I also recommend it. I had to do that myself. That's why.
Yes.
Because, meditation doesn't cure everything. And so, we have, the masters in our tradition, there's an instruction, just meditate more, and you will obviously ultimately be able to see into the nature of reality. However, particularly in the West, I don't know about other places, but if you're dealing with psychological issues, family issues, it can interfere with your ability to meditate. And you can be asking too much of meditation, to cure all that. However, the two are a really good combination, I think, because more clarity through meditation can help you. If you have the right therapist, and if you're not if you have somebody who has a spiritual perspective and orientation, who's not about, years and years of therapy, but who knows that you're a spiritual being and you're going to work through certain things and can help you do that. And that for yourself, that's helpful.
Right. And so moving beyond that, when an individual might assume or be at a place where they could be considered intermediate, meaning that they know the basics, they're practicing the yamas and niyamas, they meditate regularly, they take care of their resources and their responsibilities. What do you see that might be obstacles to maintaining that kind of level of practice and also continuing to deepen the process at that kind of what we might call intermediate stage?
I don't know, life, I guess.
Well, I can come up with ideas of what you might mean by that, but what do you mean by life?
Well, life is ever changing, and really yoga practice is designed to help us live skillfully in a world that is always in flux. And so as we move through life, as you mentioned in the beginning, things change, and we can encounter grave difficulties. And so one of the things I see is, when that happens in people's lives, and even when they're established yogis, generally that carries them. They have an insight about what's happening, but it doesn't stop in a sense, what we would think of as an interruption. Like, this is an interruption to my yoga, right? Whether it's illness in the family or financial difficulty, or even something very positive like having a baby, right? These things can seem like interruption to our life as a Kriya yogi. So what is helpful is that ultimate reframe that your life as a Kriya yogi is deepened by these experiences of life in flux. And you may not be able to keep the same sadhana that you had before, because you might be continually interrupted. However, if you have a teacher, a spiritual friend, that can remind you that the work of the soul goes on, and I think, I have written about it being, like an underground stream at those times that is flowing so deeply and really transforming the heart, the mind, the soul in a way that at the time is unknown to us, but later is revealed. Did that answer your question?
Did that answer my question?
About what do you do when you're buzzing along, and then?
Yeah. I think that gave insight into I think it put it into perspective what I would consider to be the fact that once you're solid and stable in your practice and in your theory and in your philosophy and in your activity, that as life happens, if you can keep it into perspective, that, as you said, there's like this river of grace or river of spirit underneath. If you can keep that in perspective, then maybe it's possible to see how these changes and transformations can contribute to deeper understanding. Does that?
Yes. And it's helpful to have some kind of touchstone, which, for me has been a relationship with the guru. Mm-hmm. Now it's relationship, I'm still with him inwardly, but, with others in the Kriya Yoga Satsang, sort of to kind of hold you as you move through those times in life. And keep you aware, because sometimes people drift,
Right.
And I've seen that over the years, because, we've had services on Sundays continuous for 40 years.
Wow.
Yeah. And so I've seen people like come and go. And sometimes, people will be right there. They're loving the path, they're inspired, they're practicing, and then something in their life happens. And it might be something that's so-called positive or so-called negative, but then they drift away. And then sometimes, like 10 years, 20 years later, here they come, mm-hmm. And it's like, wow, that was an interesting arc,
Right.
And if it's somebody who's taken a really long time to get back, the ones who do make it back, often they have a lot of sorrow about that. Not about what happened in their life, but how they kind of got away from their practice for so long and feel like they wasted valuable time.
Yeah, yeah, and that makes me think of the idea or the term guru, at least from a Vedic astrology standpoint. That term often also means like heavy or anchor, and so the guru in one's life is that which anchors one, and kind of. I used to fish a lot, so for me it makes sense. You have the anchor, which is down on the bottom of the lake or the river, and the boat's trying to push around a little bit, but it's not going anywhere because there's that anchor, that connection.
Yeah,
and that's very valuable. I think about what you just mentioned about individuals who kind of go away for a little bit and come back, and that kind of sorrow that they have, and I wonder. Have you ever tried to prevent that? Like, meaning, have you seen it happen and thought to yourself, you're going to regret this, not in a judgmental way, but I just know the psychology of how this might go. Have you ever tried to prevent that from happening with anyone? And if so, did it work?
No, it doesn't work. At least I've never seen that. I learned fairly early on in teaching Kriya Yoga that I wasn't in charge.
Right.
And that was really helpful because I think it's a common mistake of teachers early on to feel like it's up to you, whether people come and stay or whether they go, like I can remember this. It was like, in the beginning thinking, oh, so-and-so has left. It was something I said, like, and I'm going in my mind, like, well, what did I do that caused this person to leave? And then it happened that there was somebody who came, there was a student who came that I really wished that they would leave.
Okay.
and I really couldn't make that person leave.
Uh-huh.
And so that was my insight, that person was so steady, and it was a open, and of course I was praying about this topic too. And the teaching is, of course, it's not about you. Everybody has their destiny, and they are doing whatever they need to do, in accordance with their karma, their destiny, and divine grace in their life. I think the most effective thing is what our gurus have done in our lineage for us, which is to pray for us, right? And so I do pray for students. And by that, I don't pray that they come back, and, I don't pray that they will leave, but I just, and I don't even pray actively, like have a list of people that I'm supposed to pray for. I just notice when people come into my consciousness. Mm-hmm. And when they do, then I just hang out in the higher awareness, with them for a time. And that's the prayer of, recognizing them as the divine being that they are. And then, however God is guiding their journey is good. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember sitting with Mr. Davis up in the chalet one time, and I was asking him, it was just a year or two after I was ordained, and I had an issue with, people keep coming and people keep going, and I was bringing that up, and he said, Ryan, you have to remember that this is just karma yoga for you and us, that we're, like you said, we're not in control of this. We're here to be a representative of this teaching so people can have access to it, but we can't control what they do or don't do. And that was I understood it when he said it, but it took a while to sink in.
Yeah. And for me, it was getting off my own ego. Like, it was up to me. It could be something that I did or didn't do. We just do our best and give it to God. That's our practice as karma yogis. That is, less selfless service. We think of less self in our service.
So early on in this discussion, you were talking about how people mention that maybe they're older when they come to find Kriya Yoga, or they recognize the importance of spiritual practice. One woman, I was going to go speak at a Unity church here in a few weeks, and she found out about it, and she wrote to me and said, "I know you're an astrologer. Maybe I could have a session with you." And I explained to her that I'd retired from that at this point, and maybe that will help get me in gear because I'm older and I don't know how much time I have left. And I said, "Well, how about we'll just put all that aside and I'll just tell you, you don't have all the time you think you have. And it's best if you just start doing your spiritual practice again now and forget about the astrology bit." But what I would tell people is, even if they come to spiritual practice or the importance of it later in life, at least they're doing it. Yes, the majority of the world never even gets the idea. So I think it's important to stress that. And when you were talking about people who go away and come back, and there's the sense of maybe sorrow around that, is there anything in particular that you say to them? I mean, because all life is part of our path. So whatever they went through in that time, I mean, that was part of gaining the wisdom to recognize the importance of getting back into meditation and so on. Is there anything you say to them in particular?
Well, yeah, there's a couple of things. One is that, as yogis, we take the long view, right? I mean, we're all about, it's helpful, to have the inclination and the focus to wake up fully in this lifetime. But, we also see, as it's said in the Bhagavad Gita, that whatever progress you make in this lifetime is not lost. So that's really helpful. I think it's encouraging, so that's an important reminder. And second part is that in terms of qualification for the path, which has been kind of a theme, we haven't specifically named it in our conversation. But as you mentioned, people go, maybe they're gone for a year or 2 years or 10 years, and they come back, and, what has changed? What has life taught them? And hopefully what has occurred is a clarification of discernment that, the teachings, the classical teachings point out that at a certain point, we become aware that we are kind of doing the same thing over and over in our life, and it's not working. And we don't know how to make it work. And so we come to the spiritual path, looking for a different way. And so that crux point is really critical. And I think when people come back, hopefully they're there, because what they've seen is that they've gone away and tried to, in a sense, do it on their own, like the prodigal son, do it the same way, but they wake up and see the repeating pattern. And that initial quickening of discernment is what's required for Kriya Yoga, because then there's a renunciation or a non-attachment that comes after that, where you decide that you're going to stop asking other people in the world to give it to you, and you're going to sincerely find it for yourself.
Right. And that triggered another idea, not just going away from the path, but early on, as we discussed, the idea that people think once they get interested in meditation, yoga, that it's just going to be smooth sailing. In my own life, I have to say, even though I met Roy fairly young in my life, and I started practicing meditation fairly young, and that was consistent over these years, that when I think back about the things that helped my spiritual growth, yes, I'm sure those things were helpful, but it was what I experienced in life that made me realize what I feel I realize. So I think it's important to also admit that living your life and doing your best with it might end up being part of the best spiritual practice you can have.
Absolutely. And I even heard our guru muse about that at one point. He said, how does awakening come about? Is it all of the practice that we do, or is it a matter of maturing in life? He was musing on that as well, like life experiences, and you learn, if you're intent on learning. I think that's the thing. If one of the things about yoga is the teaching to face life straight on, Like, don't distract yourself with addictions and other such things that dull your awareness. And because if you do that, if you have active addictions, then you don't mature. You just keep avoiding. So if you, as a yogi, face life straight on, it is completely valuable for learning.
But that can be very raw. I mean, I know we're coming close to our time, but it brought up a very important point, and that is, I personally agree with this idea of seeing and coming to life straight on. But that can be, the only word that comes up is raw, because you can't BS your way out of it. You can't sleep through it. You can't ignore it. You have to actually embrace it. So you, whom are one that when I listen to you speak and I think about your ministry, I'm typically filled with a sense of comfort and joy. So thank you. I don't have that skill. So when you are thinking about expressing to people how to move through or deal with or just embrace this rawness, how do you do that?
I think for me, I'm aware that life breaks our heart. If you really live it, it breaks everybody's heart. And that's what it is, in a sense, to be human and to feel your connection with all humanity and all of life. But it's also what opens us to the divine, that level of vulnerability.
Right.
So I guess that's what I would say about it.
Mm. Wow. Then we will contemplate that a bit. Well, on that note, is there any final thoughts that you have for our listeners? I know we're going to hear one of your poems from your book to close out, but I'm curious, do you have any final thoughts or pieces of advice for beginner to intermediate yogis?
Well, maybe I should say something more about life breaking your heart.
Okay. I didn't have anything to follow up with that. So yes, that would be great.
So, I have the blessing of having children who are, grown and children of their own now. There was one point, and I was on the path at that time, but my eldest daughter, was gravely ill. And I was praying, I was trying to hold her, hold that whole thing together, right? To be the supportive presence that I could be. And I did some kind of a drawing about this, like there was her, there was me, and I was, making a circle around us. And what came to me is that, my heart was breaking, as a mother. But that as my heart was breaking, I realized that we were being held, that there was a greater presence that was holding us. So what I mean by the heart breaking open is that it breaks open beyond the egoic boundaries that we've had of our little life that we control, and, into the larger life. Like when you read Autobiography of a Yogi, and Paramahansaji, lost his mother, that broke his heart, and it introduced him to Divine Mother.
Right.
So that's what I mean about life will break your heart, and it's painful, but it also is a doorway into divine love that is pervasive.
Yes. It's still so profoundly raw, though. I mean, and the only reason I keep coming back to that is because talking about life experiences and what you've shared, I mean, that same thing happened in my life. And would I have wanted that? Would I have invited it? Had someone told me it was going to happen 10 years earlier, would I have been like, yes, this is going to be how I know God? No, but it happens. And when these things happen, I guess the hang up I have on that is, personally, it felt like I was forced into it. And in your experience, I would guess that since there was not really control there, that might, I'm not want to put words in your mouth, but that might have also been a sense of no escape or something of that nature. But, at the end of it, there was that opening, there was that realization. And again, that brings me back to the idea of how can you really help people to prepare for that or to make the most of it? Or is it just a time to hold them and see them in their true essence while they're going through difficulties, hoping that maybe there will be that breaking open and that realization that comes after it? Because to me, there's like this fine line, because I've seen people whom have had their heart broken and they just go the other direction. There's no more spirituality. It's just bitterness and crushedness. And I've seen others whom have gone through such tragic circumstances as yogis, as spiritual people or not, and it has completely opened them up. So my curiosity about all that is, how to encourage or help one or individuals, humans who are going to go through that so that they move more fully into that realization? Or does it just come back to we're not in control of that and it just has to be what it is?
Yeah, of course, we're not in control of that, but we are in control of, as Mr. Davis reminded you in what you shared today, is that we are in control of sharing with people what this practice is and how they can live it. Over all these decades, what I have seen, and I have seen people face really difficult situations in life, loss and loss upon loss. And those who have had a strong root in Kriya Yoga, they just testify. They say, I don't know how I would have gone through this without having a spiritual foundation. Right. And so that gives me great hope. And that was true for me. It was just early on the path when that particular incident that I shared, came up. Right. And over the years, of course, life being what it is, I've experienced many other things that have allowed me to feel this grace that carries us through the most difficult times.
And very final bit is that, even when the difficulties do arise, one of the important things about exploring this kind of spirituality and so on is that it also opens up a greater vulnerability to accept and appreciate the good things in life, to see them and appreciate them when they are there without smothering them with attachment. So does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, that's very helpful. I think just experiencing every day, and the graces that are there every day. And sometimes when people are going through difficult times, life is incredibly beautiful. Mm-hmm. So it's just going back to what we were saying, earlier on, is that, or I was saying anyway, that this world is ever changing, and Kriya Yoga prepares us to be in this world skillfully, to respond, to whatever is there. And I'm really grateful for that. And so I can conclude on gratitude, if that's good.
That is good. And again, I want to thank you for, it took us a long time to schedule this. So thank you. It's been over a year, I think, since we've been working on this.
Yeah, and thank you for persevering. And again, congratulations on this perseverance with your podcast. And I want to thank your listeners for keeping it going, because that's a very important part, people telling other people about it. And so thanks to everyone tuning in, listening to this.
Yes, and it's wonderful to have you. And if you don't mind, I would love to hear your concluding poem.
Oh, I always like to read a poem because, poems point to what we can't really say. So maybe I'll read this one. It's a devotional poem. It's called The Beloved's Gift. Everything shines in the pure light of morning. Even we who close our eyes at night, weary of the world, awaken each day the glimmering kiss of the beloved still shining upon our brow. The call comes. Blades of grass hear it, standing in the meadow as brides, wearing beads of radiance, the color of surrender. Hear the call. Hasten to prayer as they do. Turn to the one who has kissed you. Bend before love.
Thank you.
Thank you.